Today, the United States is home to about 342,000 Taiwanese immigrants, making them the 24th largest immigrant group in the United States. California is home to about 168,592 Taiwanese immigrants, representing 49% of all Taiwanese immigrants in the United States. So to give you a little bit of background information, I want to first explain to you who are the Taiwanese. The Taiwanese are ethnically Chinese. They speak their own dialect as well as Mandarin. However, there are important reasons that date back in history that explain why the Taiwanese have maintained their distinct identity and object to being identified with the mainland Chinese state, even though they still associate themselves with the Chinese nation. My main argument for this presentation is, during the early and mid-1970s, a large influx of Taiwanese immigrants immigrated to the United States, primarily due to political unrest between Taiwan and China and the hope for better economic opportunities in the United States. The political tension and internal rivalry between the two major parties in China, the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang Party, instilled fear in many Taiwanese-born people and initiated migration. The Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, was in constant disagreement with the Nationalist Party, known as Kuomintang, founded by Sun Yat-sen. The Chinese Communist Party advocated for Marxism-Leninism, which proposed the establishment of a proletarian dictatorship. The majority of the property and economic resources were owned and controlled by the government, rather than individual citizens who had minimal to no say in the laws enforced. The primary purpose of the Chinese Communist Party was to create a stateless, classless society. The Chinese Communist Party was formed as a direct challenge to the Kuomintang Party, which, in contrast to the Communist Party, advocated for Sun Yat-sen's three principles of the people, which argued for nationalism, democracy, and the people's livelihood. The continued disagreement between the two groups eventually led to the Chinese Civil War. This war was an ideological separation between the Kuomintang Party and the Communist Party. In October of 1949, Mao Zedong declared victory and decreed that communism would rule the new People's Republic of China. The nationalist government, defeated by the Chinese Communist Party, along with 1.5 million Chinese, fled the mainland to Taiwan in the late 1940s to escape being controlled under the Communist Party, where they set up a Chinese counterpart government in exile. The majority of the native Taiwanese fiercely opposed reunification with the mainland because during the early days of the regime, they were repressed by the Communist Party in such a way that many were imprisoned or killed and suppressed of local traditions, which bred a lot of resentment from the Taiwanese. However, in the early 1970s, political instability sparked again for the Taiwanese when U.S. President Nixon made an agreement with Mao Zedong that the United States recognized Taiwan as part of China. Henry Kissinger, the assistant to the president for national security affairs, secretly traveled to Beijing twice during 1971 to discuss the conditions under which each side would consider a normalization of relations. His second trip coincided with the vote on Chinese representation in the United States. A source from JSTOR states, the new influx of immigration from Taiwan is closely related to the island's political instability. Despite the rapid economic growth which has brought prosperity to Taiwan, the Taiwanese have constantly worried about their country's long-term prospects with regard to its relationship with the People's Republic of China. And sure enough, the member states of the United Nations voted to seat the PRC delegation in place of the Taiwan delegation. In October of 1971, Resolution 2758 was passed by the UN General Assembly, which expelled the people who supported Chiang Kai-shek from the UN as well as replaced Taiwan as part of China. The UN General Assembly recognized that the government of the People's Republic of China was the sole legal representative of China in the United Nations, and decided to immediately remove Chiang Kai-shek's representatives from the seats of the United Nations. Nixon once again traveled to Communist China in 1972. The two governments issued the Shanghai Communique, in which each articulated its position on the Taiwan issue. The People's Republic of China affirmed that Taiwan was a part of China, and that it opposed all attempts to create two Chinas, one China and one Taiwan, or an independent Taiwan. The United States literally declared that Taiwan is a part of China and that it did not challenge that position. Mao and Zhou made clear to Nixon that their country would not normalize relations with the United States as long as Washington continued formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Nixon stated that the United States did not support Taiwanese independence.
I remember with the Nixon agreement and his visit to China, it worried many Taiwanese citizens as it left ambiguous feelings whether the United States would continue to protect Taiwan from their independence from China. After Taiwan was excluded from the United Nations, your great-grandfather wanted to protect his family from having to go through communism. He encouraged all of his sons to immigrate to the United States to attain their citizenship, so that in the case that China would invade Taiwan, his sons would be protected.
My great-grandfather was concerned about the political instability and that Taiwan could be converted back into communism. Taiwan was essentially excluded from representation in the United Nations, and many feared that Taiwan would be taken over by Communist China, which triggered a wave of migration out of Taiwan to the United States. In addition to political instability inciting many Taiwanese to migrate to the United States, the economic opportunities the U.S. offered also played a significant role. The Immigration Act of 1965 abolished an earlier quota system based on national origin and established a new immigration law based on reuniting immigrant families and attracting skilled labor to the United States. The 1965 Act opened doors to immigrants from all around the world. Taiwanese business owners quickly used this opportunity to escape the communist pressure back home and migrated to the United States for better business. According to a survey from 1988, 1/10 of Taiwan's largest business owners interviewed had immigrated or were planning to immigrate, and about a quarter were contemplating at least moving their family members overseas. Los Angeles had received a substantial number of this entrepreneurial immigration. This group of entrepreneurial immigrants had played a dominant role in the development of business. My grandparents were one of the many who were motivated to immigrate to the United States as a result of the Immigration Act of 1965. In my interview with my grandmother, she recalls,
Your great-grandfather built his success with establishing the first ever dairy company in Taiwan, which later grew to become a publicly traded company. He saw the U.S. with a wealth of opportunities to grow and expand his business. He encouraged all of his sons to move to the United States and to help him expand the business ventures he had built in Taiwan.
Due to the two concerns that his sons could be oppressed by the growing communist pressure and that the success of his business could be turned over without any notice if China took over Taiwan, he told all of his sons to move to the United States to keep themselves safe and simultaneously expand his food company. Therefore, my grandpa, grandma, mom, and aunt took part as the first wave of Taiwanese immigrants to the United States who settled in Los Angeles, California in November of 1975. My grandfather was 34 years old, my grandmother was 27 years old, and with my aunt who was 3 years of age, and my mom who was 1 year old. On their arrival to the United States, they settled in the city of Los Angeles and in the suburbs of Monterey Park. Life was not easy for them at first. Upon the first months of their arrival, life was not the way they dreamed it to be. Speaking very little English, the language barrier was the number one challenge for them as it affected their ability to communicate with others, which was vital for day-to-day activities. It created problems from purchasing anything ranging from household needs to getting furniture and knowing where to buy it, to obtaining medical care, to the children's education. Speaking very little English and knowing barely anyone around who spoke Chinese, they had a hard time settling in. And according to my grandmother, it took them around 3 years before they felt more comfortable living in the United States. As the larger population of Taiwanese communities settled in Monterey Park, it became the unofficial capital of Taiwanese America. By the 2000s, more than 61% of the population was Asian, with Taiwanese immigrants as the largest ethnic group. Monterey Park's transformation was due to a few successful Chinese American real estate developers, and my grandfather was one of the larger contributors to these projects. In the 1970s, a group of Taiwanese business people who had immigrated to Monterey Park created a mini shopping center and many properties around it to simulate the experience of a shopping square in Taipei. My grandfather saw a myriad of development opportunities in the United States, and he founded Weitren Construction Company. He was one of the few real estate developers who invested in blocks of land around the vicinity of the Dingho Market, one of the first Asian markets in the Los Angeles area that was named after a famous plaza in Taipei. He was able to turn the properties into strip malls that offered Chinese food, boutiques, and bookshops, and was influential in infusing Taiwanese presence. In the early 1970s, Monterey Park was only about 15% Asian. However, by the 1980s, Monterey Park became often referred to as Little Taipei, as they created a community that made the Taiwanese feel like they were back home, and the development that promoted Taiwanese culture into its neighboring communities. Immigration is a global phenomenon caused by a variety of reasons, including economic, social, political, cultural, environmental, health, and education factors. In my presentation, the influx of Taiwanese immigrants to the United States in the early and mid-1970s came for economic and political reasons. In general, immigration commonly takes place because of the push factors. In my case, that is the less opportunities in the socioeconomic situation and the political instability and fear in Taiwan at the time. And also because of pull factors that exist in more developed areas. The trend of Taiwanese immigrants started to slow down in the 1990s. In 1989, 13,974 Taiwanese immigrated to the United States. 10 years later, the number was barely half than that. A number of factors slowed immigration in the late 1980s and 1990s, and even encouraged some Taiwanese immigrants to return. I hope from this presentation you were able to learn more about Taiwan's long history of gaining independence and the major causes of the first wave of Taiwanese immigration to the United States. Thank you.